The envelope was already sealed when they handed it to me. My brother didn't even look up from his phone. That was the moment I understood that grief for some people is just an inconvenience between them and what they want. My grandmother died on a Tuesday morning in April, 3 weeks after her 81st birthday. She passed quietly in the bedroom she'd slept in for 47 years, with the lake visible through the window and her hand in mine. I had been staying with her for the last 8 months. I had taken a leave of absence from my job, driven 14 hours from Phoenix to her house in northern Wisconsin, and moved into the small guest room at the end of the hall because she asked me to and because there was no version of me that could have said no to her. My brother flew in the morning of the funeral. His wife arrived the same afternoon. They stayed at a hotel in town. I want to be careful about how I tell this because it would be easy to make them into simple villains and leave it at that. But I think the truth is more complicated and honestly more sad. My brother is not a cruel person by nature. He's just a person who decided a long time ago that comfort was more important than effort, and that decision had been compounding interest for 30 years. His wife is sharper, more deliberate. She noticed things. She calculated. If he was the one who forgot to call our grandmother on her birthday, she was the one who remembered to send a card signed with both their names. I noticed things too. I just noticed different things. Our grandmother, who I called Gran, had since I was 3 years old been a retired thoracic surgeon. She had practiced for 34 years at the same hospital in Milwaukee, had trained dozens of residents, had published research that I couldn't begin to understand, and had retired at 72 only because her hands had started to betray her. She was, above all else, a woman who understood when a chapter was finished. She moved to the lake house full-time after that. She read, she gardened, she kept meticulous journals in a handwriting that looked like something out of a different century. She never complained. That was the thing about her. Even at the end, when the pain was bad and the medication made her foggy and she sometimes forgot what day it was, she never once said, "Why me?" or "This isn't fair." She just kept looking at the lake. I asked her once, about 2 months before she died, how she stayed so calm. She was quiet for a long time, then she said, "Because I already know how this story ends, sweetheart. The only question I'm still curious about is who you're going to be after." I didn't fully understand that until later. The estate attorney's name was Mr. Calloway. He was a careful man, methodical in the way that people become after decades of watching families fall apart over dining room furniture. He had handled my grandmother's affairs for nearly 20 years. He called the day after the funeral and asked if we could all meet at the house on Friday morning. My brother and his wife drove over from the hotel. I made coffee. Nobody talked much. The morning light was coming in flat and gray off the lake, and the house felt different already, not empty exactly, but rearranged somehow, like all the air had shifted. Mr. Calloway sat at the dining room table and set a folder in front of him. He explained that my grandmother's estate included the lake house and its full contents, a brokerage account, a smaller savings account, and a trust that had been established 12 years earlier. He read through the document steadily, without drama. My grandmother had left the brokerage account and savings together worth a little over $200,000 to be divided equally between my brother and me. The trust, which held the lake house and its surrounding 11 acres, he said, was a different matter. The house had been appraised the previous year at $9.4 million. My brother's wife sat up slightly in her chair. Mr. Calloway explained that my grandmother had made my brother the primary beneficiary of the trust. The property would transfer to him, provided he satisfied a set of conditions outlined in the trust documents, which Mr. Calloway then summarized. Maintain the property in good condition, pay the property taxes, and not sell for a period of at least 5 years unless both heirs agreed. My brother nodded. His wife was already looking around the room with a different kind of attention than before. Mr. Calloway closed the folder. He looked at all three of us. He asked if there were any questions. There were none. He packed his things, shook hands, and left. My brother waited until the car was out of the driveway. Then he turned to me and said they'd need me out by Sunday. I looked at him for a moment. I thought maybe I'd misheard. "I'm sorry, we're going to want to go through things," he said. "Start figuring out what to do with the place. It'll just be easier if you're not here." His wife was looking out the window at the lake. I said, "Gran died 4 days ago." He said he knew that. He said it wasn't personal. He said I could take whatever I wanted from the guest room, obviously, and that they'd donate the rest of my grandmother's clothes to charity once they'd gone through them. He said this the way you'd say, "We'll figure out the recycling situation." I stood there in my grandmother's kitchen in the house I had lived in for 8 months, in the house where I had held her hand while she died, and I felt the floor do something very strange beneath me. Not fall, more like dissolve, like I was suddenly standing on something that had no intention of holding my weight. I said, "She asked me to be here." He said, "I know, and you were. It mattered, but she's gone now, and this is our house." His wife finally turned from the window. She said gently, in the way you talk to someone you've already decided doesn't matter, "We just need some time and space to process." You understand? I understood something. I'm not sure it was what she meant. I went to the guest room. I sat on the edge of the bed and put my hands on my knees and breathed for a while. Out the small window, I could see the edge of the dock, the same dock where my grandmother had taught me to fish when I was 7. Where we had sat every summer evening for as long as I could remember, watching the water go dark. I packed what was mine. It didn't take long. 8 months of living carefully in someone else's space means you never spread out too much. I took my clothes, my books, the small framed photograph of my grandmother and me that had been on the nightstand, and the letters she had written me over the years, which I had kept in a shoebox since college. I did not take the journals. They were hers. They belonged to the house. My brother carried one of my bags to my car. He seemed relieved. He said we'd talk soon. He said family was important. I drove to a motel in town. I sat on the motel bed and looked at the popcorn ceiling and thought about the fact that I had given up my apartment, my job, and 8 months of my life. And that the last thing I had done before leaving the house was wash the coffee cups from that morning because I didn't want to leave them in the sink. I called my closest friend. She answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting, which is the only thing anyone can really do in those moments. When I finished, she said, "What do you need right now?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "Okay." That's allowed. I stayed in the motel for 3 nights. On the 4th morning, my phone rang. It was Mr. Calloway. He asked how I was doing and then he paused and said, "I have a question I need to ask you. Did your brother read the complete trust document, all of it?" I said, "I don't know." He had been handed a copy at the meeting. I assumed he had. Mr. Calloway was quiet for a moment. He said, "I ask because the document has 2 sections. The first governs the primary transfer of the property, which I read at our meeting. The second section is a conditional addendum. It's only 4 pages, but it's rather important. The reason I didn't read it aloud on Friday is that it requires a 60-day observation period to have elapsed before it becomes active." He paused again. "I sent your brother a certified letter explaining this 2 days ago. I want to make sure you were also made aware." I sat up. He said, "I think you should come to my office, Miss Hartley. There are some things in that addendum that concern you directly." I drove to his office that afternoon. He had the document open on his desk and a second chair pulled up, which I took to mean he'd been expecting me to take this seriously. The addendum, he explained, was something my grandmother had added to the trust 3 years ago, about a year after my grandfather died. She had been thinking, Mr. Calloway said, about what she'd seen over decades in hospitals, in courtrooms, in families. She'd told him she had watched too many people show their real character only after a loss when they thought no one was paying attention anymore. So she had built a mechanism. The addendum stated that for a period of 60 days following her death, the behavior of the beneficiary toward other family members, specifically toward me, would be observed and documented. Mr. Calloway himself was the designated observer, authorized to collect any relevant communications, speak with witnesses, and review any documented evidence of conduct. At the end of 60 days, he would prepare a report. If the primary beneficiary had, during that period, taken any action that constituted willful exclusion, financial coercion, or deliberate harm toward the secondary heir, defined in my grandmother's careful legal language as the grandchild who provided primary caregiving in the final year of the testator's life, then the trust's controlling interest would transfer to me. I read that paragraph 3 times. Mr. Calloway said, "Your grandmother was a very precise woman." I said, "She really was." He explained that I had nothing to do and nothing to prove. The burden was not on me. He had already begun documenting. He had the certified letter he'd sent my brother. He had his own notes from Friday's meeting. And he said carefully that if there was anything else I thought he should be aware of, any written communication, any witnesses to what had happened at the house, I was welcome to share it. I thought about the text message my brother had sent me Saturday morning confirming Sunday as my move-out date. I thought about the voicemail his wife had left me 2 days later, cheerful and brisk, asking if I'd gotten settled and mentioning that they were already thinking about some renovations. I pulled out my phone. I spent the next 53 days living in a short-term rental I found through a friend of a friend. It was a small one-bedroom above a hardware store in a town about 20 minutes from the lake. The floorboards creaked, the bathroom faucet dripped. I slept better than I had in years. I went back to work remotely. I cooked. I called my friend most evenings. I went to the lake sometimes and sat on the public beach access down the road watching the water. I did not drive past my grandmother's house. I thought about her constantly, but not in the sharp way grief usually cuts. More like she was present in the way that someone is present when they've changed the way you see something permanently. I thought about what she had said. The only question I'm still curious about is who you're going to be after. My brother called once about 3 weeks in. He said he hoped I was doing well, that he wanted to stay in touch, that family was important. I thanked him for calling. We spoke for about 6 minutes. He did not ask where I was living. He did not ask how I was managing financially. He mentioned that they'd started talking to a contractor about opening up the kitchen layout. I said that sounded nice. I did not tell him about the addendum. Mr. Calloway had advised me that I was under no obligation to, and that it would be cleaner for the process if I didn't. On day 61, Mr. Calloway called and asked me to come in. He had a thick folder on the desk this time. He walked me through it methodically, the way he did everything. He had the text messages I'd provided. He had the voicemail transcript. He had a signed statement from the realtor my brother had contacted on day 9 days after the funeral, to inquire about listing the property, which was a direct violation of the 5-year non-sale condition in the primary trust document. He had Mr. Calloway's own contemporaneous notes from every communication with my brother's household over those 60 days. He said the report was unambiguous. He said the conditional addendum had been triggered. He folded his hands on the desk and looked at me. He said, "Miss Hartley, the trust now transfers to you, the lake house, the 11 acres, everything in it. There are some administrative steps, but effectively it's yours. Your grandmother knew what she was doing." I looked at the folder. I looked at the window outside. It was a bright May morning, the kind that makes Wisconsin look like a painting. I said, "What happens to my brother?" Mr. Calloway said that the forfeiture clause was clear. My brother would receive his half of the brokerage and savings accounts as originally specified, just over $100,000. He would have no claim on the property. I was quiet for a long time. Here is what I did not do. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect a moment like this to feel like winning, like a door slamming in the right direction. But what I felt was mostly tired and sad and very aware of the fact that my grandmother was still gone and that no house, no matter what it was worth, was going to change that. What I felt underneath all of it was her. I thought about what she had built into that document, not a trap, not a punishment, but a test. A question she was still asking from wherever she was. Who are you going to be when it costs you something? And I thought about the fact that she had trusted me to answer it correctly before she even knew what the question would look like in practice. She had given my brother the same chance. He had just answered differently. I called my brother that evening. He answered on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting. I told him about the addendum. I explained what it meant. I gave him time to process, which he used mostly to be very quiet and then to say, "She did this on purpose." I said, "I think she did almost everything on purpose." He said some other things. His wife said some things in the background that I could half hear. I let him say them. When he was finished, I said, "I'm not calling to argue or to make you feel a certain way. I'm calling because you're my brother and I wanted you to hear this from me." He hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while, then I made dinner and ate it standing up at the kitchen window of my little rental, watching the streetlights come on over the hardware store parking lot below. Moving back into the lake house took one afternoon. I hadn't owned enough things to make it complicated. The hardest part was walking back into her bedroom. The journals were still on the shelves where she'd kept them, 37 volumes in matching green covers going back to 1978. I didn't open them that day. I just sat in the chair by the window and looked at them and felt the particular weight of being trusted with something irreplaceable. I found a note she had left for me. Mr. Calloway had mentioned there might be one tucked into the addendum paperwork. It was handwritten, 2 paragraphs in that handwriting that looked like a different century. She wrote that she hoped I wasn't angry with her for the complexity of it all. She wrote that she had spent her career watching people's best and worst selves come out in extremity, and that she had simply wanted to know, needed to know, that whatever she left behind would end up in the hands of someone who could hold it without being changed by it in the wrong direction. She wrote at the end, "You were always the one who stayed, not because I asked you to, but because you couldn't imagine doing otherwise. That is the only inheritance that matters, everything else is just property." I read that twice. Then I folded it and put it in the shoe box with the other letters. In the months that followed, I made some decisions. I kept my remote work situation and stayed at the lake full-time at least through the end of the year. I had a ramp installed on the side of the dock, the one my grandmother had wanted for 2 years but kept putting off because it felt like finishing something. I hired a local woman to help me go through the house room by room, cataloging everything carefully, photographing what needed to be photographed, donating what could be donated. I also had a conversation with Mr. Calloway about the medical equipment in the study. My grandmother had kept a small collection of historical surgical instruments that she'd gathered over her career. He connected me with a medical history archivist at the University of Wisconsin who was very interested. It felt like the right place for them. She would have liked that. My brother contacted me again in September. A letter this time which surprised me, handwritten which surprised me more. It was short, half a page, and it said without quite saying it that he was sorry. He didn't use the word. He said he had been thinking about Gran a lot and that he'd been thinking about Sunday and that he hadn't handled things well. He said he hoped I was doing okay at the lake. I wrote back, longer than he had written. I told him I was okay. I told him about the ramp on the dock and the archivist and the way the lake looked in September. I told him I'd found a photograph of the 2 of us at the house, must have been 1998, sitting on that same dock with Gran between us. I said I was going to have it framed. I didn't tell him I'd already cried over that photograph twice. That felt like something I could keep for myself. He wrote back once more, shorter. He said thank you. He said he'd like to visit sometime if that was okay. I said it was okay. I meant it mostly. What I've learned in the way that you learn things that cost you something, slowly, incompletely, with revisions, is that the people who leave us don't just leave us their belongings or their money or even their memories. They leave us the shape of their thinking, the architecture of how they moved through the world. And if we're paying attention, if we're actually listening to what they were doing all those years while we were just being around them, we inherit something that can't be appraised or contested or transferred by any legal document. My grandmother was a surgeon. She understood better than most that you could hold something precious and fragile in your hands without flinching. That steadiness under pressure was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move through it anyway. She spent 81 years being that kind of person. She spent her last 8 months teaching me without once announcing that's what she was doing, how to do the same. The lake is frozen now. I can see it from the desk where I'm writing this, solid and white and very still, the way it gets in January up here when the cold comes in hard from the northwest and everything goes quiet. There's a quote from one of her early journals that I found when I finally started reading them. She wrote it the year she finished her residency, which would have been 1970. She wrote, "The goal is not to be unshaken. The goal is to remain yourself while the shaking happens." I've been thinking about that a lot lately. About what it means to stay yourself when circumstances are doing everything they can to make you into something smaller or harder or meaner. About the fact that my grandmother apparently started thinking about that question in 1970 and was still thinking about it in the addendum she added to her trust document in 2021, 51 years later. Some people spend their whole lives asking the same question in different forms. I think that's what it looks like to take something seriously. She asked me who I was going to be after. I'm still figuring it out, but I'm figuring it out in her house, at her desk, looking out at her lake. And I think she'd say that's a pretty good place too.